Left to the mercy of fate by Austrian allies, Suvorov continued to stay in Switzerland until Paul I severed his alliance with Austria. The turn in the foreign policy of Paul I and the conspiracy of March 11, 1801. Suvorov's victories in Italy exacerbated internal contradictions in the Anglo-Austro-Russian coalition. The Austrians, secretly from Russia, began negotiations with the French about peace. At the same time, they betrayed Russian troops at the approach of the French, leading their armies to the rear. Finally, expelling Suvorov, in his words, from northern Italy, conquered by him, the Austrians seized the possessions of the Sardinian king, whom the Russian army rendered military assistance, and removed the Russian fleet from Italy. After a series of such treacherous actions by his allies, Paul I wrote a letter to the Austrian emperor about breaking the alliance. From now on, I stop caring about your benefits and will take care of my own and other allies' own benefits. Suvorov Paul I ordered to begin a return campaign to Russia. You should save the kings, he wrote, now save the Russian soldiers and the honor of your sovereign. With great difficulty, Suvorov brought Russian troops out of Switzerland. He was awarded the rank of Generalissimo of all Russian military forces, but then he was unexpectedly subjected to a new Tsarist disgrace. In Russia, Suvorov returned physically completely shattered. Under the very St. Petersburg, Suvorov learned that all preparations for his grand meeting were cancelled. In St. Petersburg, he was to enter at night, so that the people could not meet with honor the commander. The Tsar forbade Suvorov to appear at his palace. His illness increased, and on May 18, 1800, the great Russian commander died all alone. Another important circumstance characterizing the Napoleonic Wars is the intensification of the contradictions between France and England due to the division of markets. Russian Tsarism, interested in trade with England, took its side. Entering the throne, Alexander I immediately restored friendly relations with England, withdrew his arrest from English ships, permitted the importation of English goods. In 1801, Russia and England concluded a convention on mutual friendship. But Alexander I did not go to break with Napoleon. Russia's ally, England, was also forced to make peace with Napoleon in 1802 in Amiens. The Amiens world was short-lived. So, in 1804, Russia signed a military agreement with England. Under the leadership of England, a new coalition was organized against France consisting of England, Russia, Austria, and Sweden. Britain promised a financial subsidy to its allies and demanded immediate action. The purpose of this coalition was not only the struggle against the seizures of Napoleon, but also the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in France. Austria was the first to join the struggle against Napoleonic France, and in August 1805 a Russian army under Kutuzov's command was sent to help. The entry of Russian troops into Europe prevented Napoleon's planned crossing of the English Channel and thus saved England from the landing of the already prepared 150,000-strong Napoleonic army. In difficult conditions, Kutuzov reached an accelerated march to the Bavarian town of Brau. Here he learned that the main forces of the Austrian Allied forces, led by General Macomb, capitulated in the fortress of Ulm. Kutuzov had 5 times less troops than Napoleon, and he had to retreat. Napoleon instructed his best generals to cut off Kutuzov's path of retreat. Kutuzov, in turn, ordered Bagration to detain the cavalry of Murat, pursuing the Russian army. Walking ahead of Bagration, the Austrians betrayed their allies and entered into negotiations with Murat, and the small 6,000 detachment of Bagration was surrounded by a 30,000-strong French army. The battle between the Russians and the French occurred under Schengravin and lasted all day and half the night. In the night battle, Bagration was able to break out of the encirclement. All survivors of the Battle of Schengravin received special bandages with the inscription, 1 against 5, indicating that the French in number were 5 times superior to Russians. The retreat of Russian troops, exhausting the enemy, changed the balance of forces. Already in mid-November, at the position near Olmyt, Kutuzov brought 86,000 soldiers, and Napoleon concentrated here 90,000. The Russian army was badly supplied and was very tired. But the Emperor Alexander I, who came to the army, who dreamed of the glory of the commander, did not want to hear about the rest of the soldiers. The Austrian Emperor Franz I and his generals also insisted on an immediate general battle. The military council, in spite of Kutuzov's resistance, decided on the battle. The plan for the upcoming battle was drawn up by the incompetent Austrian General Weyrother. Kutuzov was actually removed from the leadership of the troops. The Russian-Austrian army is located on a large hilly field near the village of Austerlitz, in the Czech Republic. On a foggy morning on December 2, 3 columns of Russian troops led an attack on the right flank of the French. Tsar Alexander expressed Kutuzov's dissatisfaction with the slow development of the offensive. Kutuzov said that he was waiting until all the troops were collected. "After all, we are not in the Tsaritsyn meadow," the emperor said discontentedly, "where the parade does not begin until all the regiments come." Kutuzov replied, "Sire, that's why I do not begin, that we are not in the Tsaritsyn meadow." The French inflicted a terrible blow to the scattered Allied forces at Austerlitz. Russian soldiers fought heroically, but could not withstand the frenzied onslaught of superior enemy forces. Napoleon himself acknowledged the heroism of the Russian soldiers. The defeat of Austerlitz was the result of interference in the command of military operations by the Austrian and Russian emperors. This defeat prompted Austria to make peace with France. Napoleon occupied Vienna and began to prepare forces for a further war in Europe, primarily against Prussia. In the autumn of 1806 Alexander sent troops to the aid of Prussia. But at that time Napoleon surrounded the Prussians with a rapid onslaught and defeated them under Jena. Berlin was surrendered to the French without a fight, and for 2 years, from 1806 to 1808, he was in the hands of the French. Napoleon concentrated his troops on the Vistula, threatening to go on the offensive against Russia. In January 1807, he entered Warsaw. A month later, a battle took place with the Russian army at Przyaslaw, which showed the strength of the Russians. Napoleon did not achieve victory here and began to prepare for a new decisive battle. In the summer of 1807, the Battle of Friedland took place, during which the Russian army lost almost a quarter of its composition, and this decided the outcome of the entire campaign. But Napoleon did not feel strong enough to continue the struggle with Russia. He was interested in making peace. In the world signed in Tilsit in June 1807 between Napoleon and Alexander I, Russia had to recognize all the conquests of Napoleon, and he himself, the emperor, and conclude a defensive and offensive alliance with him, and most importantly, to join the so-called continental blockade, that is, to an economic war against England. Napoleon hoped to break the commercial power of England, isolating it from European countries. The continental system was proclaimed by Napoleon in 1806. All states dependent on the Napoleonic Empire were forbidden to trade with England. Russia also undertook to stop the export of grain to England and the importation of goods from England. However, this blockade caused great economic damage to Russia. She ruined many Russian landlords, as the prices for bread fell and trade turnover fell. The blockade caused a financial crisis in the country. The Peace of Tilsit was met hostilely by the Russian nobility. The closest friends of Alexander I, Kochubey, Czartoryski, Novosiltsev, resigned. Speransky, who was considered an adherent of the French party, became an advisor to the Tsar. Speransky, 1772-1839. The dissatisfaction of the landowners with the continental blockade was combined with sharp opposition to the projects of state reforms, the most dangerous supporter of which they considered Speransky. The son of a village priest, a former seminarian and clerk in the office of the prosecutor general, Mikhail Speransky made a quick career, becoming the state secretary, and after Tilsit, The closest advisor to Alexander I in 1809, Speransky completed his transformation project entitled Introduction to the Code of State Laws. This was an extensive reform plan, based on the idea of adapting the feudal monarchy to developing bourgeois relations. Speransky demanded protection of science, commerce and industry. Without making an open demand for the emancipation of the peasants, Speransky wanted for them personal freedom. There is no example in history that an enlightened and commercial people could stay in slavery for a long time, he wrote in his draft. Speransky proposed to convene the State Duma of people who own property, regardless of their class status. Owners of immovables must elect a parish council in each volost. Parish councils elect deputies to the district councils, who send deputies to provincial councils, and provincial ones to the State Duma. Elections, thus, were planned four-stage. Without the State Duma and the State Council, there cannot be a single law. Executive power should be in the hands of ministers responsible to the Duma. Speransky's project was progressive for the time character. Project Speransky caused extreme indignation of most landlords. Speransky was called villain, revolutionary, Cromwell. Frightened by this mood of the nobility, Alexander I resolutely refused any plans for a constitutional reorganization of Russia. In 1810, only the State Council was formed, whose members were appointed by the emperor. It was a consultative institution under the Tsar, preserved in this form until 1906. The number of ministers increased to 11. The ministries of police, communications and state control were established. The nobility of the opposition resolutely sought to renounce the blockade, as well as the resignation of Speransky. The most vivid exponent of the moods of feudal landowners was the famous historian N.M. Karamzin. The Note on Ancient and New Russia written by him formulated the basic requirements of the nobility. Instead of limiting the autocracy, Karamzin proposed a draft selection of 50 good governors who should be entrusted with the management of the state. The noble reactionary opposition demanded the inviolability of serfdom, the resumption of trade with Britain, the abandonment of the Treaty of Tilsit, the struggle against Napoleon, and the removal from the administration of the dangerous reformer Speransky. The Russo-Swedish War of 1808–1809, and the annexation of Finland. The Tilsit world has changed international relations in Europe. Napoleon sought to use Russia in the interests of his aggressive policy, primarily to fight against England. At his insistence, Russia broke off diplomatic relations with England. Napoleon pushed Russia into the war with Sweden, which refused to join the continental blockade and concluded an alliance with England. For Russia, the war with Sweden, which at that time was part of Finland, was provoked by serious strategic considerations. It was necessary to secure from the north the capital of Russia, Petersburg, located close to the border. In February 1808 the Russian troops crossed the border. In March they occupied the Åland Islands and in April, the island of Gotland. In the last months of 1808 the war was transferred to the territory of Sweden. The Russian units began their offensive in severe winter conditions. The detachment under the command of Barclay de Tolly made a famous ice hike from Vasa along the ice of the Gulf of Bothnia to Sweden. The road was blocked by huge blocks of ice. Snow in many places was above the knees. Heroically overcoming the difficulties of the campaign, the Russian troops approached the Swedish shore. At the height of the offensive against Sweden, Alexander I summoned the Finnish Sejm in Borgo in March 1809. The day before, an act on the recognition of the Finnish autonomy was published. At the Sejm, the Tsar promised Finland, which was declared a Russian province, to preserve in the indestructible and immutable force and action the Finnish constitution. During the meeting of the Diet, Russia and Sweden began peace negotiations, which ended September 5, 1809, with the signing of a peace treaty in Fredrikshamn. Sweden conceded to Russia all the Finnish troops conquered by the Russian troops. The Swedish king announced his accession to the continental blockade. preparation of the aggressive campaign of Napoleon to Russia. The Napoleonic government was a bourgeois government that strangled the French Revolution and retained only those results of the revolution that were profitable for the big bourgeoisie. Stalin, on the deficiencies of party work and measures to eliminate Trotskyist and other double talks, Gospoditas. 1938, p. 7. In the interests of the big bourgeoisie of France, competing with English capital, Napoleon waged his wars of conquest in Europe and beyond. All the European countries he conquered, Napoleon forced to join the continental blockade against England. Despite the peace in Tilsit, Napoleon was also preparing intensively for an aggressive campaign in Russia. For the war with Russia, Napoleon was motivated by a desire for world domination, which he could not achieve without crushing Russia. Preparing for the war, Napoleon collected information about Russia, studied its economic situation, sent spies to Russia, even sent false Russian banknotes to Russia. At the same time, Napoleon also created a military bridgehead against Russia. Poland became such a foothold. In 1807, Napoleon established a new Polish state under the name of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw and the provinces that had moved to Prussia after the sections. The Austrian Galicia was then annexed to it. Seeking to enlist the help of the Polish gentry, Napoleon promised to restore Poland in its old predatory borders, that is, to annex Lithuania, Belorussia and part of Ukraine. At the suggestion of Napoleon, in 1807, serfdom was abolished in Poland. The peasants received personal freedom, but the land remained the property of the landlords. The Tsarist government was extremely concerned about the situation in Poland. Alexander I demanded from Napoleon that he renounce the support of the Poles in the matter of restoring the old borders of Poland and did not hinder Russia in its striving to establish itself in the Black Sea Straits. Napoleon did not agree to fulfill these requirements. Relations between the Allies were aggravated. Meanwhile, the events in Europe have become more complicated. In Spain, the People's Liberation War against the French invaders unfolded. The Spaniards defeated the French in a number of major battles. Austria began to arm and seek an alliance with Russia against Napoleon. Prussia also began reorganizing its army. Wishing to keep Russia on his side, Napoleon, on a new meeting of the two emperors, which took place in Erfurt in the autumn of 1808, was compelled to agree to the annexation of Moldavia and Wallachia to Russia. Despite the aggravation of the struggle on the European continent, caused by the resistance to the aggressive policies of Napoleon, the latter continued aggression. In 1810, Napoleon annexed to his empire Holland, the Hanseatic cities and the Duchy of Oldenburg, which was ruled by a relative of Alexander I. The Russian emperor pronounced a resolute protest in this regard, but Napoleon did not demonstratively accept the Russian note of protest. The breakup of Napoleon-Alexander I was prompted also by Russia's internal position. The continental blockade put the country in front of the threat of economic ruin. Still not breaking with Napoleon, Alexander I began with him an actual customs war. Tariff rates on French goods were increased. English goods arrived in Russia on ships under neutral flags. The supreme nobility of Russia at this time achieved the removal of Speransky, whom everyone considered an adherent of the alliance with Napoleon. The state secretary was accused of treason and sent first to Nizhny Novgorod, and then to Perm. The War of Russia with Turkey 1806, 1812 GG. The preparation of the war with France accelerated the end of military operations against Turkey, which had been conducted since 1806. The Turks sought to use the defeats of the Russian army in the fields of Europe to drive Russian troops out of the western Transcaucasus and restore their dominance on the Black Sea. Turkey was supported by France. Russia's attempts to resolve the disputed issues peacefully have not been successful. In November 1806, despite the fact that the main forces of the Russian army were occupied in Europe, part of the Russian troops entered the territory of the Danube principalities, which were under Turkey's rule. Soon all of Bessarabia, Moldavia and Wallachia were occupied by Russian troops. The advance of the Russian army was suspended only at the Danube River, where there were strong Turkish fortresses. The Russian command decided to launch an offensive against the Turks from the Transcaucasus. Both sides were preparing for major offensive operations, but at that time a message was received about the signing of the Peace of Tilsit. Napoleon acted as an intermediary between Russia and Turkey in order to achieve an end to the war between them. During the Erfurt meeting, Tsar Alexander I secured Napoleon's consent to the accession of the Danube principalities to Russia, the proclamation of Serbia's independence and the recognition of the Russian protectorate over Georgia. Turkey refused peace talks on these terms. In March 1809, military actions between Turkey and Russia resumed. Russian troops besieged a number of Turkish fortresses, firmly seized the right bank of the Danube and approached the foot of the Balkans. Turkish troops suffered a number of heavy defeats, but their resistance was not completely broken. The imminent break with Napoleon demanded an early end to the protracted Russian-Turkish War. In 1811, Kutuzov took command over the army that was operating against the Turks. After defeating the Turks in the Battle of Rushuk, he soon surrounded and destroyed the enemy's 60,000-strong army. This brilliant victory of Kutuzov forced the Supreme Vizier to ask for peace. May 16, 1812 was concluded Bucharest Peace, according to which Turkey ceded to Russia Bessarabia. In Transcaucasia, Russia returned Turkey to Poti and Akalkalaki. The Bucharest Peace was a major victory for Russia, which could now transfer its Danube army to the struggle against Napoleon. 26. The Domestic War of 1812. The invasion of Napoleon by Russia. In a campaign against Russia, Napoleon moved not only his main troops, but also mobilized the armies of all the countries of Europe conquered by him. At a critical moment, Kutuzov sent reinforcements to Bagration. At this time, more than 400 French guns were smashed by the left wing of the Russian front. The Russians there had up to 300 guns. Thus, in the space of 1 square kilometer up to 700 guns thundered. The bravery of Russian gunners was amazing. French. One of the participants in the battle writes in his memoirs, "Russian gunmen were faithful to their duty. They took redoubts, lay down on cannons and did not give them without a fight. Often wounded in one arm, the gunner acted differently. The sky was covered with a dark cloud of powder smoke, with red lights from grenades. The village of Semyonovskaya was flaming, set on fire from all directions. Napoleon brought fresh reserves into battle. Bagration moved his troops in a counterattack. During this battle, Bagration was mortally wounded. He tried to rise from the ground, but could not. The hero commander was taken from the battlefield. Overcoming the pain, Bagration gave the last orders. Losing consciousness, he asked, "How are my soldiers?" "Keep steadfast," was the answer. The command was received by the brave Dokhtyarov. He managed to stop the confusion, and the troops, who learned of the death wound of Bagration, died to everyone, not a step back. He ordered. Still, the left wing of the Russian front was broken. Bagration's flushes were taken by the French. At a time when the assault on Bagration's flushes was still in progress, Kutuzov decided to undertake a cavalry charge in the rear of the enemy. The attack of Cossacks at Aman-Platov and General Uvarov's cavalry made a serious confusion in the ranks of the French troops. He distracted the attention of the enemy and enabled Kutuzov to regroup forces and strengthen the center's defense. After the capture of the Bagration flesh, Napoleon sent a powerful artillery fire to the Raevsky battery, which became the arena of the bloody struggle of two warring armies. By the end of the day, in the fierce battle, almost all the defenders of the battery were killed. Raevsky's battery was taken. But this private tactical success could not compensate for the French failure of the whole battle. The great Russian poet Lermontov in the poem, Borodino, showed the intensity of the battle and the heroism of the Russian soldiers. The enemy knew a lot that day, and the volleys of 1,000 guns. What does the Russian battle mean? We merged into a long howl, our hand-to-hand fighting. Here it was. Everyone was ready. Earth shook, Like our breaths, Zatra battle to start anew mixed in a bunch of horses, people, and stand until the end. In the evening Napoleon ordered to withdraw his troops from the battlefield. Not having any shells or reserves, the Russian army in complete order retreated from Borodino to Moscow. In the Battle of Borodino, the Russian people once again demonstrated with what heroism and dedication that they can fight when it is necessary to defend their homeland and their national independence in battle. The Fire of Moscow. Kutuzov retreated from Borodino to Mozhainsk and thence to Moscow. On September 1, 1812, he convened a military council in the village of Fili, near Moscow, at which the question was discussed whether to take a new battle or retreat for Moscow. The opinions of the generals were divided. Then Kutuzov interrupted the meeting and said that he ordered to retreat. With the loss of Moscow, Russia has not been lost, Kutuzov said. The pernicious policy of Alexander I, which tore down the supply of the Russian army and its replenishment by reserves, forced Kutuzov to take this decision. He understood that there was still a heavy struggle ahead. It was necessary to prepare a counter-offensive, for which it was necessary to preserve the living force of the army. From early morning on September 2, the Russian army marched through Moscow in a continuous march. Together with the army left and Moscow residents. On foot and in the carriages, with hastily seized belongings, the Muscovites have blocked all the roads from Moscow. When the long and narrow Arbat stretched the cavalry of Murat, which entered Moscow, the city was quiet and deserted. In it there were only foreigners and not having time to leave inhabitants. The same night, fires began in Moscow. The wind scattered sparks of fiery rain on the wooden buildings, and they lit up one after another. Residential houses, warehouses, shops, shopping arcades on Red Square burned. French soldiers and marauders ran into the houses and dragged everything that had escaped the fire. The fires lasted 6 days. Russian eyewitnesses of the Moscow fire testify to the deliberate arson and destruction of the great city by Napoleon. Even the French General Chambord wrote that, since Smolensk, the campaign has taken the form of an invasion reminiscent of the invasion of the barbarians. Preparation of a counter-offensive of the Russian army. The Napoleonic army, exhausted by the long heavy campaign, hungry, stripped, demoralized, remained in burning Moscow. Napoleon began to seek peace with Russia. But he sought to sign the peace in Moscow, in order to save his prestige in Europe. Napoleon made several peace proposals to Alexander I in a personal letter to the Tsar, sent with Yakovlev, Curzon's father. Napoleon urged Alexander I to restore friendship. But Alexander I did not answer all the proposals of the world. Winter was approaching. There was no food in Moscow. But in the Moscow cellars still a lot of wine. Among the French soldiers there was a general drunkenness. The soldiers turned into drunken marauders. In the city there were constant robberies and murders. Departing from Moscow, Kutuzov led his army along the Ryazan road, and from there he turned sharply to Tarutino. Here Kutuzov covered Kaluga with its supplies of food and equipment and Tula with its arms factory. Here he enlarged his army with men and prepared for a counter-offensive. This remarkable flanking march was thus the beginning of an offensive against Napoleon's army and its encirclement from the south. Only now did Napoleon unravel Kutuzov's tactics and decided to leave Moscow hastily. At 7 am on October 6 Napoleon began a retreat from Moscow. On his orders an attempt was made to blow up the Kremlin. But the rain damped the wicks and mortgage mines, and the destruction was less significant. Only one tower and part of the Kremlin wall were destroyed. Napoleon decided to break through to the south and went to Kaluga, where there were food stocks of the Russian army. But Kutuzov, after making a detour maneuver, cut off the path to Napoleon. Under Maloyaroslavets, a serious battle unfolded. The city passed several times from hand to hand. Napoleon was forced to turn to the Smolensk road. The French army passed through the ruined cities and villages, burning everything that still survived. At this time, The famine in the army took a catastrophic size. In addition to horse meat, there was nothing to eat. The entire Smolensk road, along which Napoleon's troops ran erratically, was covered with human and horse corpses. The peasants took part in guerrilla warfare against the enemy, making it difficult for the French to withdraw by numerous unexpected attacks. One of the organizers of the partisan detachments was Lieutenant Colonel Denis Davidov. Hussar and poet, Denis Davidov was the son of a cavalry officer. From his early childhood, he dreamed of military glory. As a boy of 9 years, he drew the attention of Suvorov. The commander foretold him a glorious military future. Since then, the image of the great Suvorov all his life inspired Davidov. At the beginning of the war in 1812, when the Russian army retreated to Moscow, Denis Davidov, then a lieutenant colonel of the Aktorsky Hussar Regiment, told Kutuzov of his guerrilla war project in the enemy's rear, with the active support of the broad masses of the people. Kutuzov immediately appreciated and approved the project Davidov. He invited him, in the form of experience, to organize a small detachment of 50 hussars and 150 Cossacks, who soon marched south of Bzhetsk. Davidov contacted the peasants' partisans of the Sykevskaya Ist. From an old drawing, with peasant volunteer detachments and with their support began to operate successfully in the rear of the French. Davidov's detachment quickly expanded. Kutuzov summoned Denis Davidov to him, thanked him for his valiant service and, kissing, said, "Your successful experiments have proved to me the benefit of guerrilla warfare, which has inflicted so much harm, inflicts on the enemy." Later, Denis Davidov summarized his rich experience of guerrilla warfare in a special work entitled, "The Experience of the Theory of Guerrilla Action." Describing the true guerrilla warfare, Davidov wrote that it embraces and suppresses all space from the rear of the opposing army to the natural foundation of this, Razya in the weakest places of the enemy, pulls out the roots of his existence, subjects it to blows of his army, without food, without charges, and blocks his way to retreat. Here is guerrilla war in the full sense of the word. Davidov predicted that the partisan struggle would play a big role in other liberation wars of the Russian people. Partisans made attacks and sudden raids on the entire line occupied by the French, on warehouses, on convoys with food, on couriers with papers. The organizers of partisan detachments were often soldiers and peasants. The soldier of the Dragoon Regiment Ermolai Verdakov, who fled from the French captivity, gathered a partisan detachment in the surrounding villages near Bzhetsk. Partisan officer Finner often made his way to the Napoleonic camp in the French uniform. Partisan Slavin once brought in a saddle captured by him in captivity French intelligence officer. Partisan Gerasim Kudrin made a detachment of peasants, armed them with weapons taken away from the French. Starostich Vasilisa Kozina, in the Smolensk province, has interrupted a lot of marauders, Napoleon's soldiers, with pitchfork and a scythe. The counter-offensive of the Russian army and the defeat of Napoleon. The great army of Napoleon, persistently pursued and attacked by the Russian army, reached enormous difficulties with Smolensk, where she hoped to find food and rest. But Smolensk burned out just like Moscow. Horses all fell because of a lack of forage. The remnants of provisions were stolen by hungry soldiers who broke up warehouses. Discipline finally fell. In addition, severe frost struck. Soldiers in the squares burned carriages, carts, furniture left in the houses. Among the soldiers there were at least 30,000 patients. But it was not the Russian frosts that caused the defeat of the Great Army. In a special work, Did Moros Destroy the French Army in 1812? Denis Davidov says that in the days of retreat, Napoleonic army weather was warm, the first snow fell only near Elnya, and the frost did not exceed 12 degrees, lasting no more than 3 or 5 days. How to think, Davidov wrote, that the 150,000 strong army could lose its influence. The expulsion of Napoleon from Russia in 1812. The flight of the French from Russia. From Klein's drawing, 65,000 people are only from 3 or 5 days of frost, while much more severe frosts in 1795 in the Netherlands, in 1807 during the Ilev campaign, lasted about 2 months in a row, and in 1808 in Spain among the Castilian mountains, throughout the winter campaign, glided, so to speak, over the surface of the French army, not penetrating into the middle of it. The valor and firmness of the Russian army, which was supported by all the people who rose to the national war, were the cause of the defeat of the army of Napoleon. Rapidly pursuing the enemy along the line of his retreat, Kutuzov inflicted severe blows on the French in a number of battles. The army of Napoleon lost all artillery and actually itself collapsed. Napoleon hardly made his way to the river Berezina, through which the crossing was to be. Fighting off the Russian troops that were attacking him, Napoleon began crossing the remnants of his recently great army. The crossing took place under a hail of cords and bullets, along bridges, which, together with people, crashed into the river. Many were crushed by horses, others were beveled with bullets and cords or sunk during the ferry. At least 10,000 French people died in Berezina. About 60,000 people crossed the Berezina, but this army continued to thin out. At the end of December, from the great army there were barely 30,000 left, and Napoleon, leaving his defeated army, hastily left for Paris. Summing up the counter-offensive of the Russian army, Kutuzov wrote in an order to the army of December 21, 1812, "There was not yet an example of such brilliant victories. 2 months in a row your hand punished the villains every day. Their path is strewn with cords, but in their flight the leader himself did not seek other than personal salvation." The War of 1812 was a folk, domestic, just war. In this war, the Russian people defended the national independence of Russia. The heroism of the Russian army, supported by the partisans' performances, ensured victory in the war against Napoleon, one of the most powerful conquerors world history knew. Great were the merits in the War of 1812 and our brilliant military commander Mikhail Kutuzov, who ruined Napoleon and his army with the help of a well-prepared counter-offensive. J.V. Stalin, Bolshevik, 1947, number 3, p. 8. During the Great Patriotic War, Soviet soldiers were awarded the Order of Kutuzov against Nazi Germany for the best examples of military valor and heroism. 27. Charity in the chief of the European reaction. The campaign of Alexander I to Europe. In January 1813, the Russian army, pursuing the Napoleonic army, entered the territory of Poland and Prussia. The peoples of Europe rose to the national liberation struggle against the conqueror, Napoleon. The national liberation movement of the European peoples, subjugated by Napoleon, contributed to the military successes of the coalition of powers that pursued Napoleon. But the Tsar and his allies used this national liberation struggle of the peoples not for their real liberation, but for the restoration of feudal order in Europe. In the autumn of 1813, Napoleon was defeated in the so-called People's Battle near Leipzig. The Allied armies led by Alexander I in March 1814 entered Paris. In France, the overthrown monarchy of the Bourbons was restored. Napoleon was deposed and exiled to the island of Elba. To share the territories taken from France, a Congress of European monarchs was convened in Vienna. In May 1815, a general act of the Vienna Congress was signed, according to which Russia received for the eternal times most of the Warsaw Duchy. During the Congress of Vienna, Napoleon fled from the island of Elba and returned to Paris. About 100 days he fought for power, but was finally defeated in the Battle of Waterloo. The Allied army took Paris again. Napoleon was exiled to the island of St. Helena and died there in 1821. The French throne was joined by Louis XVIII, brother of King Louis XVI, executed during the Revolution. To fight the revolution in Europe in 1815, the Holy Alliance of the three reactionary monarchs, Austria, Prussia and Russia, was created, to which all the continental monarchs gradually joined. The leader and inspirer of the Holy Alliance was Alexander I. After the victory over Napoleon and after the Congress of Vienna, the role of Tsarist Russia in Europe grew enormously. The Sacred Union, wrote Marx, was only a mask of the hegemony of the Tsar over all the governments of Europe. K. Marx and F. Engels, SOCH, VXV, p. 548. At the Congresses of the Holy Alliance, as directed by the Russian Tsar, measures were being developed to combat the revolutionary movement in Italy, Spain and other European countries. Russian Tsarism turned into an international gendarme. Arakcheyevshchina. The counter-revolutionary program of the Sacred Union became the basis for the domestic policy of Alexander I. The most vivid expression of this was the friend and advisor of the Tsar, Arakcheyev, a small-formed artillery officer, who became a military minister. Arakcheyev received exceptional influence and power. Arakcheyev appointed and replaced governors and senior officials. In his hand was the police. Bribery, sycophancy, arbitrariness and savage brutality characterized the entire system of Arakcheyev's administration, which was called Arakcheyevism. Arakcheyeva was called half-emperor. He had clean forms with the signature of the emperor, which he used at his discretion. Especially he mocked the serfs. In his Georgian estate there were always tubs with brine, in which the bars for torturing serfs were wet. Women and children went for weeks with slingshots around their necks for the slightest fault. The cursed serpent. The violent monster. That is how even the royal approximate ones spoke of him. In awarding Arakcheyev with the title of a count, Paul I wrote in his coat of arms the words, "Without flattery is betrayed." These words in the society were altered. Demon, flattery is betrayed. General hatred for Arakcheyev was well expressed by Pushkin in the epigram, "All oppressor Russia, full of anger, full of vengeance, governor's tormentor who is he, faithful without flattery. And the council he is a teacher, without a mind, without feelings, without honor, and to the Tsar he is a friend and brother, a penniless soldier." Particularly hated Arakcheyev for the organization of military settlements, initiated by Alexander I. The so-called villages and volos of state peasants, transferred to the military ministry. Peasants in military settlements were turned into lifelong and hereditary soldiers. At the same time, they also carried out agricultural work. Thus the army kept itself. In addition to the desire to reduce the cost of maintaining a huge army, the Tsar hoped, with the help of military settlements, to protect himself from peasant unrest. Successfully developed in Ukraine distilling. Ukrainian fairs have developed a lot. Contracts for selling bread, renting estates, selling handicraft products, etc., were concluded at the Kiev Contract Fair. Ukraine was increasingly turning into a market for Russian goods. In the first quarter of the XX century, almost one-third of all Russian textile products were sold in Ukraine. Black Sea ports, Odessa, Nikolaev, Kherson, became the centers of trade of Russia with Western Europe and the countries of the East. From the second half of the X8th century, the colonial dependence of Ukraine on Tsarist Russia increased even more, but at the same time the close economic and cultural ties between the Ukrainian and Russian peoples increased. The western part of Ukraine, which had departed from the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to Austria, became known as Galicia. The Austrian government sought to number the population of Galicia. To this end, at the end of the X8th century, in Lviv, the German university was opened. Under Austrian domination Galicia remained an agrarian, economically backward country. The land was still in the hands of the Polish landowners. The Polish gentry sought to preserve serfdom. This caused frequent peasant uprisings in Galicia. 29. Transformation in the first quarter of the XIX century. The transition of eastern Georgia to the power of Russia. In the X8th century, Transcaucasia was divided into small feudal states. East Georgia was subordinate to Iran, and western Georgia to Turkey. The bloody wars between Iran and Turkey led to an even more dismemberment of the Caucasus and Transcaucasia. In the X8th century, the peasants of Georgia suffered both from systematic attacks of external enemies, and from feudal intestine and feudal serf exploitation. By their constant strife, the Georgian feudal lords promoted the humiliation and ruin of their country. Many thousands of Georgians were forcibly converted by the Turkish conquerors into Islam. Residents of Transcaucasia were sold by the thousands every year by the Turks and Iranians into slavery. Trafficking in people in Circassia was particularly flourishing. Both Sultans Turkey and Shah's Iran ravaged and devastated the lands seized by them in Transcaucasia. The wars of the Iranian Shah Nader with the Turks and Dagestanis because of the possession of Transcaucasia and Dagestan, which took place in the second quarter of the 18th century, completely bleached the country. Extraordinary tax on the population of Georgia, introduced in connection with the Indian campaign, undertaken by Nader Shah, caused a number of peasant uprisings, which were brutally suppressed. Only after the death of the conqueror of Georgia Nader Shah, the country began to gather again with forces. Under the rule of Tsar Irakli II in Transcaucasia, the East Georgian Kingdom was created, independent of Iran and Turkey. Striving to create a strong Georgian state, Irakli II successfully fought against the feudal lords and the raids of the Dagestan tribes. At the same time, he also cared about public education. He opened seminaries in Telav and Tiflis. He strove to develop crafts, trade and industry in Georgia. In this activity, Irakli II found support from the Armenian bourgeoisie. But, ruined by previous wars, the peasants were not able to pay taxes that were collected from them with the help of military force. Georgian feudal lords plundered and ravaged the peasants, who opposed their exploiters with weapons in their hands. Massive were the performances, in 1770, of monastic peasants against the Bodby monastery. The speeches of the peasants in Kartalinia in 1719, 1743 and 1744 were especially significant. Serious peasant uprisings against feudal lords took place in 1773 in the mountainous Shavia. In 1775 the peasants of the Port and monastery rebelled, and the following year, the peasants of Arbansky Bishop Justin. In the 80s of the X8th century, peasant performances spread throughout Kakheti. King Irakli II was forced to tackle the peasant question. He tried to soften serfdom, issued decrees on which returnees from serf captivity were allowed to choose their master at will and were forbidden to sell peasants without land and a loan. Irakli II established a 30-year-old prescription for the search of fugitive serfs, after which they received freedom. The grave situation of the Georgian kingdom, when the three big states, Iran, Turkey and Russia, challenged each other's dominance in Transcaucasia, forced Irakli II to seek foreign aid, primarily from Russia. Fearing the new invasion of the Iranians and the Turks, he signed in 1783 an agreement on Russia's protectorate over Georgia. Using the treaty, Tsarism began to strengthen in Transcaucasia. Where the mountain road to Georgia began, the Russian command built a fortress with a significant name, Vladikavkaz. Through the Daryal Gorge, Russian soldiers paved the Georgian military road, which cost many labors and sacrifices.